Shut up and sit down.
I brought a book from Amazon that I thought was an autobiography by Fleet Admiral Ernest King, and to my surprise a second-hand original print from 1952 arrived. It was originally owned by Vice Admiral Wilson Brown. I wanted to read King's memoirs, as a man who led the greatest navy of all time, to see what anecdotes one of the greatest leaders from the greatest generation can provide, and to see how concepts of leadership has or hasn't changed in the last century. The book is written in third person by Commander Muir Whitehill, and with a 100-year language gap I need to read the book carefully, as May plebes are not plebs. I found this a real time capsule in more ways than one, as the writing style transported me back to my undergrad days, invoking memories of reading case law from the 1800s. The book starts out with King joining the Academy in 1897. He was born to an ordinary family of craftsmen and shopkeepers. The Spanish-American War broke out a year after joining, giving King a cadetship of fire. He was literally fired at. Many of the boats used at the beginning of the King's career were still powered by wind and coal, and those new damn-fangled oil-powered boats were the latest in high tech. The Wright brothers didn't make their first flight until 1903, a couple years after King's graduation. We look at the dramatic changes caused by the internet at the turn of the 20th century, but fail to remember just how much life changed at the turn of the 19th century. Reading King's book, I realised just how much the old westerns were the original MCU, with the big names like John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, Steve McQueen and Charles Bronson. They were the original Robert Downey Jr., Christian Bale, Henry Cavill and Chris Evans. There is so much truth in the axiom that while history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. King's memoirs are more a formal outline of key facts during his life, and not much of a critical analysis of previous experiences. I was hoping to get more of an introspection of past mistakes and in hindsight alternatives that would let me see the key lessons he learnt. Inasmuch as I was hoping to get some insights into how they did leadership in the previous century, instead I found a book that was more alonious to a plot of a Star Trek movie, or rather many Star Trek movies are based on King's experiences. King promotes a key mentor during World War I in Admiral Henry Mayo, who he describes as professionally had an exceptionally open mind. He always was willing to hear all sides of the situation and discuss any matter of moment. His judgment was sound, based on his native capacity, confirmed by his long and varied experiences. But make no mistake, he was to us, his staff, always the Commander-in-Chief. Another aspect King learnt from Mayo's leadership was that good subordinate flag officers do not need to ask questions, but decide for themselves in the area of particular responsibility, this leaving the Commander-in-Chief free to handle most important decisions. And you can see from the affection between the two, when King was requested to take in confidence from Rear Admiral Wilson, King asserted he would tell the truth, not the truth that he was asked to tell. After World War I, King's first command was the Lexington, in which he prided himself on keeping a torched ship rather than a happy ship. King later claimed that torched ships were really the happy ships, since all hands knew precisely what they were expected at all times. And you can see the connection between the advice he got in 1905 from the old Boylan, Cincinnati's chief quartermaster, that the men knew that you had been strict, but they also knew you were very fair. After being courted by Rear Admiral Moffat, who repeatedly asked King to consider commands ashore, King gained a post with naval aviation. During this assignment, King felt that it was not his duty to be a yes man, but he had on two occasions speak quite bluntly to Rear Admiral Moffat. They did not always agree, but after thrashing things out, they would usually come together on a working basis. King later issued fleet policies, where he expected the exercise of initiative, so that subordinates become habituated to think, judge, decide and act for themselves. This concept of initiative also impacted King's leadership, which he expressed to make the best of what you have. It's interesting to see during the run-up to World War II, all people at all levels were expected to play the hand they were dealt, and this can only be done if subordinates have the permission to take the initiative and act independently. You can see the progression of King's leadership style, where he seems to mature from a master-servant style to a team-orientated one. He seems to have accepted that solving one problem can cause another, and that leadership is a continual compromise between being strict enough to get the job done and not strict enough as to micromanage your team. But it could be claimed that leadership is different at the bottom of the hierarchy than it is at the top. Is it micromanaging or is it mentoring? The book itself is majoritarily written by Whitehill, and a lot of what comes through comes from him. In the last two chapters, the epilogue and the notes, Whitehill speaks his own mind and gives some great insights into King's leadership style. He summarises with the following maxims: do the best with what you can, don't worry about the water that's gone over the dam, and difficulties exist to be overcome. In addition, Whitehill clearly enjoys discovering the banter between King and President Roosevelt, as he mentioned several times the note King sent to FDR reminding him that King was about to hit the mandatory retirement age. FDR wrote back asking King if he was hinting for a birthday present. Whitehill also points out King's desire to decentralise and to delegate. He refers to King jokingly stating that he managed to keep well by doing nothing that he can get anyone else to do for me. Whitehill also points out King's response to the Parliamentary Committee, that the strengths of the Joint Chiefs of Staff lie in the combined knowledge possessed by all members, and that the checks and balances that tend to prevent domination by any one person. Finally, Whitehill referenced John Boxham's book, Recreations and Diversions, and he summarises his essay of great captains with three qualities: a visualization power, seeing the whole battlefield or filling in the gaps, power to read the heart of the enemy, to predict the likely move of the adversary by knowing the rationale behind their decisions, and 3, the power to simplify, or just hardcore raw talent. In some ways, looking back at the past is always done through a modern day lens, and today's social consciousness and values. It's not fair to judge the actions and motivations of people in the past with today's standards. King's early life was quite immoral and virtuous, where everything seemed to fall into place. It seemed that the greatest adversity he suffered was coming second. As someone who has never struggled to achieve, it is often quite difficult to empathise with people who have. Early in Ensign King's career, he took it upon himself to request an order be repeated. This was seen as disobedient or incompetent. Rear Admiral Davis ordered that King be relieved of his duty and put under hatch. In reading this section, I really got the opinion that King still, to the end of his life, felt that this was an injustice that really tarnished his perfect polish, as 4 black marks on his records was too much for anyone to bear. And at no point did this experience lead King to appreciate or question that anyone else's record with black marks might be equally an injustice. Alternatively, King's greatest asset was his success. People naturally follow success, and with King's perfect shine, he was able to get his team to follow his directions. For example, during the final year of the Academy, King was ranked the highest post, a lieutenant commander. Or maybe it was his ability to sweet talk himself out of trouble, for example laughing at the first lieutenant commander in his second year, or 20 odd years later when he was pulled into an interview with Rear Admiral Andrews, where King refused the advice of the harbour pilot and took control of his ship. The inter-service rivalry between the Army and the Navy is something I think everyone could guess, but I didn't think it ran as deep as it does. And just as the saying goes, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you're a naval man, everything looks like a blockade. And when you're an army man, everything looks like a full frontal assault. And further the distinction between the Army and Navy commanders, King cites a meeting with Field Marshal Montgomery and links his quirky personal style black beret with both that of General MacArthur's gold embroiled cap and General Patton's 2 pearl-handled pistols. King comments that such personal liberties would never have happened in the Navy. Also, reading through King's recollection of the discussion between General George Marshall and himself, were the Navy's sudden requirements for very long-range aeroplanes to counter the growing German U-boat threat in the Atlantic. At no time did King stop and ask himself if there was anything he could do for the Army. He just blamed Marshall for the inter-service rivalry. One of the things I've always wondered about was who was responsible for arming the rebel groups in China, Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia and Burma. These groups were picked at random. They did nothing to fight against the Japanese. They just waited until the Allied forces had driven them out before uprising and taking over their local communities. King confirms that Marshall informed him about development of the atomic bomb. But when describing the one-upmanship between the British and the Russians, King describes the Russians as mostly over 6 foot 3 inches in height, who all look to be under 20 years of age and each having a Tommy gun. From my experience, King would not have found the Tommy gun distinctive if he was aware America was supplying large amounts of arms into Asia. I can only assume that President Roosevelt was the only one capable of keeping King in the dark about these imports. In my opinion, arming these groups was the single worst decision of the war. Also, reading the book made me realise how short both world wars were for America. Only 2 years for World War I and 4 years for World War II. For the British Commonwealth, both wars were some 2 years longer. And finally, I think there are some universal aspects to leadership. First, whether your team believes you can deliver success. And second is whether your team is confident they can do as you ask.